Hello, welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. Each episode we read about 30 minutes of history together. And today we're going to start chapter 11, entitled The Robber Barons and Rebels, out of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Voila. I'm coming to you live on location in beautiful Benicia. This is the Benicia State Capitol that served as the state capitol building of California from 1853 February until February 1854. Benicia was founded by General Vallejo, who wanted to name this town Francisca after his wife Francisca Vallejo. There's a longer more to her name than that, but a nearby town, Yerba Buena, wanted to change their name to San Francisco, and so they complained, and he ended up naming it after one of her middle names, Benicia. And just a few blocks to the west, that way, was the old Pony Express building. It's still there, although it's probably been rebuilt, where the Pony Express used to come in and then take the ferry over to Martinez, just to the south. So let's dig into our chapter, shall we? Robber barons and rebels. And if you enjoy what you're hearing, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. You know the drill. In the year 1877, the signals were given for the rest of the century. The black would be put back. The strikes of white workers would not be tolerated. The industrial and political elites of North and South would take hold of the country and organize the greatest march of economic growth in human history. They would do it with the aid of, and at the expense of, black labor, white labor, Chinese labor, European immigrant labor, female labor, rewarding them differently by race, sex, national origin, and social class in such a way as to create separate levels of oppression, a skillful terracing to stabilize the pyramid of wealth. Between the Civil War and 1900, steam and electricity replaced human muscle, iron replaced wood, and steel replaced iron. Before the Bessemer process, iron was hardened into steel at the rate of 3 to 5 tons a day. Now, the same amount could be processed in 15 minutes. Machines could now drive steel tools. Oil could lubricate machines and light homes, streets, factories. People and goods could move by railroad propelled by steam along steel rails. By 1900, there were 193,000 miles of railroad. The telephone, the typewriter, and the adding machine speeded up the work of business. These are all things we take for granted, and it's hard to picture a time when there wasn't a telephone or cell phone, TV, especially if you're under 20. No offense to those of you who are under 20. Just remember what it was like. Machines changed farming. Before the Civil War, it took 61 hours of labor to produce an acre of wheat. By 1900, it took 3 hours, 19 minutes. Manufactured ice enabled the transport of food over long distances, and the industry of meat packing was born. Steam drove textile mill spindles. It drove sewing machines. It came from coal. Pneumatic drills now drilled deeper into the earth for coal. In 1860, 14 million tons of coal were mined. By 1884, it was 100 million tons. More coal meant more steel, because coal furnaces converted iron into steel. By 1880, 1 million tons of steel were being produced. By 1910, 25 million tons. By now, electricity was beginning to replace steam. Electrical wire needed copper, of which 30,000 tons were produced in 1880, 500,000 tons by 1910. To accomplish all this, required ingenious inventors of new processes and new machines, clever organizers and administrators of the new corporations. A country rich with land and minerals and a huge supply of human beings to do the backbreaking, unhealthful, and dangerous work. Immigrants would come from Europe and China to make the new labor force. Farmers unable to buy the new machinery or pay the new railroad rates would move to the cities. Between 1860 and 1914, hello.
Hi.
Between 1860 and 1914, New York grew from 850,000 to 4 million. Chicago from 110,000 to 2 million. Philadelphia from 650,000 to 1.5 million. Hi. In some cases, the inventor himself became the organizer of businesses like Thomas Edison, inventor of electrical devices. In other cases, the businessmen compiled other people's inventions like Gustavus Swift, a Chicago butcher who put together the ice-cooled railway car with the ice-cooled warehouse to make the first national meatpacking company in 1885. James Duke used a new cigarette rolling machine that could roll, paste, and cut tubes of tobacco into 100,000 cigarettes a day. I would have appreciated that before I quit, but it's been over a year and a half. I'm good. In 1890, he combined the 4 biggest cigarette producers to form the American Tobacco Company, who you're probably less familiar with than Philip Morris or R.J. Reynolds, but they're one of the big companies. While some multimillionaires started in poverty, most did not. A study of the origins of 303 textile, railroad, and steel executives of the 1870s showed that 90% came from middle or upper class families. The Horatio Alger stories of rags to riches were true for a few men, but mostly a myth, and a useful myth for control. And it still is. Most of the fortune building was done legally, with the collaboration of the government and the courts. Sometimes the collaboration had to be paid for. Thomas Edison promised New Jersey politicians $1,000 each in return for favorable legislation. So influencing politicians with money goes way back. But you already knew that, didn't you? If you're watching this, you probably already knew that. Daniel Drew and Jay Gould spent $1 million to bribe the New York legislature to legalize their issue of $8 million in watered stock not representing real value, on the Erie Railroad. The first transcontinental railroad was built with blood, sweat, politics, and thievery out of the meeting of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. The Central Pacific started on the West Coast going east. It spent $200,000 in Washington on bribes to get 9 million acres of free land and $24 million in bonds, and paid $79 million, an overpayment of $36 million, to a construction company which really was its own. Shady. You ever watch the show? There's a show, it's called Hell on Wheels. It's really an interesting show. It's all about this time and the construction of those railroads. The construction was done by 3,000 Irish and 10,000 Chinese over a period of 4 years, working for $1 or $2 a day. The Union Pacific started in Nebraska going west, and it had been given 12 million acres of free land and $27 million in government bonds. It created the Credit Mobilier Company, or Mobilier, not sure, French pronunciation, Mobilier, and gave them $94 million for construction when the actual cost was $44 million. Shares were sold cheaply to congressmen to prevent investigation. I wonder if mine would have bought some. I bet he would have. This was at the suggestion of Massachusetts Congressman Oaks Ames, a shovel manufacturer and director of Credit Mobilier, who said, "There is no difficulty in getting men to look after their own property." Which is, man, that's so true. When our Congress is invested personally their own financial stakes in things, that sure does benefit those companies, doesn't it? The Union Pacific used 20,000 workers, war veterans, and Irish immigrants who laid 5 miles of track a day and died by the hundreds in the heat, the cold, and the battles with Indians opposing the invasion of their territory. Both railroads used longer, twisting routes to get subsidies from towns they went through. In 1869, amid music and speeches, the two crooked lines met in Utah. And I think, as I recall from that show, Hell on Wheels, they also used twisted lines because they got paid by the distance, per mile or something. So they were getting extra money by making it longer. The wild fraud on the railroads led to more control of railroad finances by bankers who wanted more stability. Shocker! The bankers in control profit by law rather than by theft. By the 1890s, most of the country's railway mileage was concentrated in 6 huge systems. Our government seems to like the number 6. 4 of these were completely or partially controlled by the House of Morgan, as in J.P. Morgan, and 2 others by the bankers Kuhn, Loeb and Company. J.P. Morgan had started before the war as the son of a banker who began selling stocks for the railroads for good commissions. During the Civil War, he bought 5,000 rifles for $3.50 each from an army arsenal and sold them to a general in the field for $22 each. Speaking of arsenals, it's rumored that when William Tecumseh Sherman actually was stationed here as an adjutant general, and when he retired from that position, Ulysses S. Grant was actually stationed here in Benicia, and it's rumored that he used to get drunk and get himself thrown in the jail at the Arsenal, which is a couple miles south of me. It's really it's an interesting story. I'm not sure about it and whether it's true or not, but it's a legend. The rifles were defective, though, and would shoot off the thumbs of the soldiers using them. A congressional committee noted this in the small print of an obscure report, but a federal judge upheld the deal as the fulfillment of a valid legal contract. Seems to be trash pickup day around here, sorry about that. Morgan had escaped military service in the Civil War by paying $300 to a substitute. The rich always manage to avoid war service, don't they? So did John D. Rockefeller, Arnold Carnegie, Philip Armour, as in Armour Meat, Jay Gould, and James Mellon of Mellon, New York Bank. Mellon's father had written to him that a man may be a patriot without risking his own life or sacrificing his health. There are plenty of lives less valuable. Didn't I just say it all? It was the firm of Drexel, Morgan and Company that was given a U.S. government contract to float a bond issue of $260 million. The government could have sold the bonds directly. It chose to pay the bankers $5 million in commission. Chose to. On January 2nd, 1889, as Gustavus Myers reports, a circular marked Private and Confidential was issued by the 3 banking houses of Drexel, Morgan and Company, Brown Brothers and Company, and Kidder Peabody and Company. The most painstaking care was exercised that this document should not find its way into the press or otherwise become public. Why this fear? Because the circular was an invitation to the great railroad magnates to assemble at Morgan's house, number 219 Madison Avenue, there to form, in the phrase of the day, an ironclad combination, a compact which would efface competition among certain railroads and unite those interests in an agreement by which the people of the United States would be bled even more effectively than before. Why do I always hear Tom Brokaw in my head going, the fleecing of America, the fleecing of America? I can't do Tom Brokaw's voice at all. But it's the fleecing of America. We've always been fleeced. There was a human cause to this exciting story of financial ingenuity. That year, 1889, records of the Interstate Commerce Commission showed that 22,000 railroad workers were killed or injured. In 1895, the gold reserve of the United States was depleted, while 26 New York City banks had $129 million in gold in their vaults. A syndicate of bankers headed by J.P. Morgan and Company, August Belmont and Company, the National City Bank, and others offered to give the government gold in exchange for bonds. President Grover Cleveland agreed. The bankers immediately resold the bonds at higher prices, making $18 million profit. Bankers always win. A journalist wrote, "If a man wants to buy beef, he must go to the butcher. If Mr. Cleveland wants much gold, he must go to the big banker." While making his fortune, Morgan brought rationality and organization to the national economy. He kept the system stable. He said, "We do not want financial convulsions and have one thing one day and another thing another day." He linked railroads to one another, all of them to banks, banks to insurance companies. By 1900, he controlled 100,000 miles of railroad, half the country's mileage. 3 insurance companies, dominated by the Morgan Group, had $1 billion in assets. Once an episode, I gotta say it, $1 billion back in those days was so much more money than it is now. And it is so much money now. They had $50 million a year to invest, money given by ordinary people for their insurance policies. Louis Brandeis, describing this in his book Other People's Money, before he became a Supreme Court justice, wrote, "They control the people through the people's own money." John D. Rockefeller, man, I keep saying Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller started as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, became a merchant, accumulated money, and decided that in the new industry of oil, who controlled the oil refineries controlled the industry. He bought his first refinery in 1862, and by 1870 set up Standard Oil Company of Ohio, soon to be Chevron. Well, not soon. Made secret agreements with railroads to ship his oil with them if they gave him rebates, discounts on their prices, and thus drove competitors out of business. One independent refiner said if we did not sell out, we would be crushed out. There was only one buyer on the market, and we had to sell at their terms. Memos like this one passed among Standard Oil officials. Wilkerson and Company received car of oil Monday 13th. Please turn another screw. A rival refinery in Buffalo was rocked by a small explosion arranged by Standard Oil officials with the refinery's chief mechanic. The Standard Oil Company by 1899 was a holding company which controlled the stock of many other companies. The capital was $110 million. The profit was $45 million a year, and John D. Rockefeller's fortune was estimated at $200 million, which in 1899 was so much more than it is now. I'm glad you know that. Before long, he would move into iron, copper, coal, shipping, and banking. Chase Manhattan Bank. Profits would be $81 million a year, and Rockefeller fortune would total $2 billion. And there are those in today's day and age that would tell you that their descendants worked hard for their money. Why should their hard-earned money go to help others? That's my politics leaking into the show. Andrew Carnegie was a telegraph clerk at 17, then secretary to the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad, then broker in Wall Street, selling railroad bonds for huge commissions, and was soon a millionaire. He went to London in 1872, saw the new Bessemer method of producing steel, and returned to the United States to build a $1 million steel plant. Foreign competition was kept out by a high tariff conveniently set by Congress, and by 1880, Carnegie was producing 10,000 tons of steel a month, making $1.5 million a year in profit. By 1900, he was making $40 million a year, and that year, at a dinner party, he agreed to sell his steel company to J.P. Morgan. He scribbled the price on a note: $492 million. Can you imagine having enough to spend $492 million cash on something? I can't even conceive of that. Morgan then formed the U.S. Steel Corporation, combining Carnegie's corporation with others. He sold stocks and bonds for $1.3 billion, about $400 million more than the combined worth of the companies, and took a fee of $150 million for arranging the consolidation. How could dividends be paid to all those stockholders and bondholders? By making sure Congress passed tariffs, keeping out foreign steel. By closing off competition and maintaining the price at $28 a ton, and by working 200,000 men 12 hours a day for wages that barely kept their families alive. And so it went. In industry after industry, shrewd, efficient businessmen building empires, choking out competition, maintaining high prices, keeping wages low, using government subsidies. These industries were the first beneficiaries of the welfare state. By the turn of the century, American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, had a monopoly of the nation's telephone system. International Harvester made 85% of all farm machinery. And in every other industry, resources became concentrated, controlled. The banks had interests in so many of these monopolies as to create an interlocking network of powerful corporation directors, each of whom sat on the boards of many other corporations. According to a Senate report of the early 20th century, Morgan, at his peak, sat on the board of 48 corporations. Holy crap! Rockefeller, 37 corporations. Meanwhile, the government of the United States was behaving almost exactly as Karl Marx described a capitalist state, pretending neutrality to maintain order, but serving the interests of the rich. Not that the rich agreed among themselves, they had disputes over policies, but the purpose of the state was to settle upper-class disputes peacefully, control lower-class rebellion, and adopt policies that would further the long-range stability of the system. The arrangement between Democrats and Republicans to elect Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877 set the tone. Whether Democrats or Republicans won, national policy would not change in any important way. When Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, ran for president in 1884, the general impression in the country was that he opposed the power of monopolies and corporations, and that the Republican Party, whose candidate was James Blaine, stood for the wealthy. But when Cleveland defeated Blaine, Jay Gould wired him, "I feel that the vast business interests of the country will be entirely safe in your hands." And he was right. One of Cleveland's chief advisors was William Whitney, a millionaire and corporation lawyer who married into the Standard Oil fortune and was appointed Secretary of the Navy by Cleveland. He immediately set about to create a steel navy, buying the steel at artificially high prices from Carnegie's plants. Cleveland himself assured industrialists that his election should not frighten them. No harm shall come to any business interest as the result of administrative policy so long as I am president. A transfer of executive control from one party to another does not mean any serious disturbance to existing conditions. The presidential election itself had avoided real issues. There was no clear understanding of which interests would gain and which would lose if certain policies were adopted. It took the usual form of election campaigns, concealing the basic similarities of the parties by dwelling on personalities, gossip, trivialities. Henry Adams, an astute literary commentator on that era, wrote to a friend about the election. Here we are, plunged in politics funnier than words can express. Very great issues are involved, but the amusing thing is that no one talks about the real interests. By common consent, they agree to let these alone. We are afraid to discuss them. Instead of this, the press is engaged in a most amusing dispute whether Mr. Cleveland had an illegitimate child and did or did not live with more than one mistress. I want to thank you for tuning in. Please do hit the like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when I make a new video. And YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people, as I say all the time. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you.